Sarah's footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor as she hurried toward room 412, clutching a fresh thermos of ginger tea. She'd perfected the recipe over the past week, adding honey and lemon, just the way James liked it. But today, something felt different. The nurses at their station weren't greeting her with their usual warm smiles. Instead, they whispered among themselves, throwing furtive glances her way. She slowed her pace as she approached his room, noticing two men in dark suits standing outside the door. Their presence made her pause, but before she could retreat, one of them spotted her. "Miss Chen." The taller man stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "We need to speak with you about Mr. Morrison." The name meant nothing to her until she glanced through the door's window. The TV was on, and there was James's face, not the gentle, confused man she'd come to know, but a powerful figure in an immaculate suit, standing at a podium with the Morrison Technologies logo behind him. James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Technologies, remains missing after what police now suspect was an attempted kidnapping. The news anchor's voice carried through the door. The billionaire entrepreneur's disappearance has sent shockwaves through Wall Street. The thermos slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, clattering against the floor. Tea spread across the linoleum like a growing stain, much like the truth seeping through her carefully constructed world. "Sarah?" James's voice came from inside the room. He was standing by the window, his hospital gown replaced by a tailored suit that transformed him into someone both familiar and utterly foreign. His eyes, the same gray eyes she'd grown to trust, were filled with a mixture of regret and desperation. "You knew," she whispered, the realization dawning. "Your memories. They came back." "When?" "3 days ago," he admitted, taking a step toward her. "I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid." "Afraid?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "You're a billionaire CEO. What could you possibly be afraid of? Of losing this, losing you." He gestured between them. "For the first time in my life, someone cared about me. Not my money, not my position, just me." Sarah felt the weight of the security guard's stares, the nurse's whispers, the whole world seemingly watching this moment unfold. Her mind raced through every interaction, every shared meal, every conversation, now tainted with doubt. "I spent my last savings on your hospital bills," she said quietly, the irony of it hitting her full force. "I picked up extra shifts to buy you clothes. I worried about how you'd manage once you were released, whether you'd be able to find work with your memory loss." James blanched. "Sarah, please let me explain." "What's there to explain?" She took a step back, then another. "You're James Morrison, billionaire CEO, and I'm just the janitor who was foolish enough to think." She shook her head, unable to finish the thought. "I have to go. I'm late for my shift." She turned and walked away, leaving behind the spilled tea, the concerned security guards, and the man who had somehow become everything to her while being nothing of who he claimed to be. The ambulance's red and blue lights painted the rain-slick streets in alternating colors as paramedics worked swiftly to stabilize the unconscious man. Sarah stood nearby, her uniform now completely drenched, reciting what she'd observed to a police officer who seemed more interested in his wet notepad than her account. "No identification on him," one paramedic called out, patting down the expensive suit. "Phone smashed to pieces, too." He held up what remained of a high-end smartphone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. Sarah's mind raced. The man's suit alone probably cost more than her monthly rent, yet here he was, nameless and vulnerable in a dark alley. The paramedic's next words snapped her from her thoughts. "We're taking him to Metropolitan. Anyone coming with him?" Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah stepped forward. "I'll go." The words surprised even her, but she couldn't bear the thought of him waking up alone. She'd been there herself, 3 years ago, when her mother had her stroke. No one should face that disorientation without a friendly face nearby. In the ambulance, Sarah watched as the paramedics worked, recognizing procedures she'd only read about in her textbooks. The man's vital signs were stable, but the head wound worried them. "Possible traumatic brain injury," one muttered, adjusting an IV line. At Metropolitan Hospital, reality crashed into Sarah's noble intentions. "Insurance information," the intake nurse asked, eyeing Sarah's wet janitor's uniform with barely concealed skepticism. I found him, Sarah explained, reaching for her own worn wallet. But I can help with the initial costs. Her fingers brushed against her credit card, the one she'd promised herself she'd only use for emergencies. Wasn't this an emergency? The next few hours blurred together. Sarah sat in the waiting room, alternating between nervous pacing and anxious dozing, her wet clothes slowly drying in the harsh fluorescent light. She called her supervisor, explaining she wouldn't make it to tomorrow's morning shift. Another day's wages lost, but she couldn't leave. Not yet. Dawn was breaking when a doctor finally approached her. Are you the one who found him? At Sarah's nod, he continued. You did everything right. The pressure you applied to the wound, keeping him stable. You probably prevented serious complications. Will he be okay? He's stable, but unconscious. The next 24 hours will be crucial. The doctor hesitated. Usually, we only allow family in these situations. But since you're the only one here, he gestured toward the ICU doors. Sarah followed him down the sterile hallway to room 412. The man lay still, monitors beeping steadily beside him. Someone had cleaned the blood from his face, and without its ghastly mask, she could see how young he really was. His features were refined, almost aristocratic, but there was something else, a slight furrow between his brows that spoke of worry, of human struggles beneath the perfectly tailored suit. Pulling a chair close to his bed, Sarah settled in for the wait. Her nursing textbook lay forgotten in her bag back at the construction site, but somehow, she felt she was exactly where she needed to be. Sarah Chen's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of Morrison Financial as she pushed her cleaning cart toward the supply closet. The digital display on her worn-out phone read 11:47 p.m., another late-night shift coming to an end. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 47th floor, she could see dark clouds gathering over Manhattan's glittering skyline, threatening to unleash a storm. 13 minutes until midnight. 13 minutes until she could catch the subway back to her tiny studio apartment in Queens, where her nursing textbooks awaited. At 26, Sarah wasn't where she'd imagined she'd be, but she held on to her mother's words like a talisman. Success is not about where you start, but how determined you are to reach the finish line. As she locked up the supply closet, Sarah caught her reflection in the window, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy bun, and her blue uniform slightly wrinkled from 12 hours of work. The other janitors had left hours ago, but she always volunteered for extra shifts. Every dollar meant one step closer to her nursing degree. The first drops of rain began to fall as Sarah exited the building, nodding goodbye to the night security guard. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, cursing herself for forgetting her umbrella again. The nearest subway station was just 3 blocks away, but the rain was quickly becoming a downpour. Taking a shortcut through the alley behind West 53rd Street, Sarah nearly missed the crumpled form in the shadows. A flash of lightning illuminated what she first thought was a pile of discarded clothes, but then she saw a hand, pale and limp, protruding from what appeared to be an expensive charcoal suit. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her heart pounding. When there was no response, she cautiously approached, her rubber-soled work shoes splashing through puddles. The man lay face down, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. Even in the dim light, she could see the dark stain spreading from his head onto the wet pavement. Years of first aid training from her nursing courses kicked in. Sarah dropped her bag and quickly knelt beside him, her uniform soaking through instantly. With gentle but firm movements, she checked his pulse, present but weak. His skin was warm despite the rain, suggesting he hadn't been there long. "Sir, can you hear me?" She carefully turned his head to the side, revealing a nasty gash above his right temple. The man remained unresponsive, but his breathing was steady. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with features that might have been handsome if they weren't so pale and slack. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, dialing 911. Rain streamed down her face as she gave the dispatcher their location, all while maintaining pressure on the stranger's wound with her free hand. In the distance, sirens began to wail, but Sarah's world had narrowed to just this: the steady rise and fall of the man's chest, the warmth of his blood seeping through her fingers, and a strange certainty that this moment would change everything. Memories returned to James like pieces of a scattered puzzle, fragments that didn't quite fit together yet. He remembered growing up somewhere cold, remembered the smell of machine oil, and his father's weathered hands. But the crucial details of his recent life remained frustratingly out of reach. The doctors assured him this was normal, that the memories would return gradually. What he didn't tell them was that part of him didn't want to remember. There was something liberating about this liminal space, where he was neither poor nor rich, neither powerful nor powerless. He was simply himself, discovering who that might be through Sarah's eyes. "You're looking stronger today," Sarah observed as they walked the hospital corridor together, his hand resting lightly on her arm for support. She'd started taking her lunch breaks at the hospital, bringing homemade meals they shared while talking about everything and nothing. "Strong enough to finally treat you to coffee," he suggested, then quickly added, "once they let me out of here, that is." The tips of his ears reddened slightly, and Sarah found herself charmed by this small sign of nervousness. "The hospital cafeteria has terrible coffee anyway," she teased, helping him back to his room. A small duffel bag sat in the corner, basic necessities she'd brought him from a nearby store, paid for with her rapidly dwindling savings. She didn't tell him about the extra shifts she'd picked up to cover these expenses, or how she'd been studying in the laundry room between loads to keep up with her classes. As they settled into their usual spots, him in the bed, her in the visitor's chair she'd practically claimed as her own, James watched her pull out her textbook. "Tell me about today's lessons," he said, genuinely interested in her studies. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about nursing made something warm unfurl in his chest. "We're studying cardiovascular systems," she began, then laughed at his exaggerated groan. "Hey, you asked. Besides, you're a pretty good study partner. Yesterday you remembered more about blood pressure regulations than I did." That made him pause. The information had come to him naturally, along with complex financial terms and an instinctive understanding of market dynamics that he couldn't explain. Sometimes he caught himself almost saying something about board meetings or quarterly reports, but the memories slipped away before he could grasp them. "Sarah," he said suddenly, interrupting her explanation of systolic pressure, what if when I remember everything, I'm not someone you'd like?" She looked up from her textbook, meeting his troubled gaze. "I don't like who you were," she said softly. "I like who you are. Right here, right now. The rest, we'll figure it out when we need to." He reached for her hand then, and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining naturally. Outside the window, the Manhattan skyline glittered in the afternoon sun, the Morrison Technologies building clearly visible among the skyscrapers. Soon, its prodigal CEO would remember everything. But for now, in this moment, they were just Sarah and James, two souls connecting in the quiet of a hospital room, unaware of the complications that awaited them. Sarah stared at the tabloid headlines splashed across her phone screen. "Billionaire is MURC, NGL or GOLD, DLGGR." Below it, a grainy photo showed her entering her apartment building, looking exhausted after a double shift. The article dissected everything from her immigrant background to her student loans, painting a picture of either calculated manipulation or fairy tale romance, depending on which paragraph you read. "You shouldn't read those," Jane said softly, reaching across her tiny kitchen table to take her phone. They were sitting in her studio apartment, where he'd insisted on coming for their conversation rather than his penthouse. His driver had caused quite a stir in her working-class neighborhood, but Jane seemed completely at ease on her second-hand chair, drinking tea from her chipped mug. "How can I not?" Sarah gestured at the window, where paparazzi had been camping out for days. "This is your world, James. This constant scrutiny, these assumptions, these judgments. I'm a private person. I just want to finish my nursing degree and help people." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, and I won't pretend it gets easier. The media attention, the social obligations, the constant pressure, it's intense. But Sarah," he leaned forward, his gray eyes earnest, "none of that has to change who you are or what you want." A notification pinged on her phone, Another email from the nursing school's dean. Ever since the story broke, the school had been practically begging her to become their poster child for their scholarship program. Everything's already changing, she whispered. Then let's change it on our terms, James suggested. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. Not the usual corporate documents she'd seen him with lately, but something else. I've been working on this. A foundation for medical education scholarships, focusing on students from working-class backgrounds. Not just tuition, but living expenses, childcare, everything that keeps talented people from pursuing their dreams. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The foundation's mission statement read like a page from her own diary, addressing all the challenges she'd faced, all the barriers she'd struggled to overcome. I'm not asking you to join my world, James continued. I'm asking if we can build something new together, something that bridges both our worlds. Sarah looked around her tiny apartment, at her nursing textbooks, her carefully budgeted grocery list on the fridge, the hospital scrubs hanging by the door. Then at James, who seemed to fill the small space not with his wealth or status, but with his presence, his understanding, his love. The media will never leave us alone, she said, testing the waters. No, he agreed, but we can use that attention to help others like you. Students who need more than just tuition assistance to make their dreams possible. Your board members might not approve of me. They work for me, not the other way around. Besides, he smiled. After that presentation you gave about hospital efficiency improvements during dinner last week, I think they're more afraid of your intelligence than your background. Sarah couldn't help but laugh, remembering how she'd passionately argued for changes in patient care protocols, completely forgetting she was dining with some of New York's most powerful executives. She'd just seen problems that needed solving, inefficiencies that affected patient care, and spoken her mind. The night shift at Morrison Financial felt longer than usual as Sarah mechanically pushed her cleaning cart past empty offices. It had been 3 days since she'd walked away from the hospital, 3 days of ignoring calls from unknown numbers and dodging reporters who'd somehow discovered her identity. The media had turned her into either a gold digger or a saint, and she wasn't sure which narrative she hated more. She was emptying trash bins on the 47th floor when she heard it, the distinctive squeak of wheels that wasn't coming from her own cart. Rounding the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. There was James Morrison, Billionaire CEO, dressed in standard-issue janitor blues, awkwardly maneuvering a cleaning cart down the hallway. His tie was gone, his usually perfect hair slightly mussed, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal strong forearms. He looked simultaneously ridiculous and endearing. You're doing it wrong, Sarah found herself saying before she could stop herself. You need to empty the recycling bins first, then trash. It's more efficient. James looked up, relief flooding his features at her acknowledgement. I never understood the logistics of maintaining this building, he admitted, abandoning his cart to face her. 47 floors, cleaned every night by people I never bothered to know. People like you, who keep this whole operation running while people like me take all the credit. Is this supposed to impress me? Sarah asked, though her voice held less bite than she intended. The billionaire CEO playing janitor for a night? No, he shook his head. This is me trying to understand your world, the way you tried to understand mine when you thought I had nothing. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. Did you know I grew up in a 2-room apartment in Brooklyn? My father was a mechanic who died with $30 in his bank account. I built Morrison Technologies from a garage startup, but somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like to work with my hands, to earn every dollar through physical labor. Sarah's grip on her cart loosened slightly. Why are you telling me this? Because when I was lying in that hospital bed, not knowing who I was, you showed me what really matters. Not the company, not the billions, but human connection. Real empathy. He gestured to his uniform. I'm not here to play at being poor or to make some grand gesture. I'm here because this is part of who you are, and I want to understand every part of you. Taking a deep breath, he continued. The night you found me, I was walking home alone because I'd just fired my security team. I was tired of being surrounded by people who only saw my bank account. Then I got jumped. 3 guys with a pipe. But you. His voice softened. You saw me at my worst, at my most vulnerable, and you helped me without knowing or caring who I was. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. You still lied to me. I did, he acknowledged. And I'll spend every day making up for that if you'll let me. But everything else, every conversation, every shared meal, every moment between us, that was real. I'm still that same person you got to know, Sarah. I just happened to have a really complicated day job. The Metropolitan Hospital's chapel had never hosted a wedding quite like this one. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across an eclectic gathering of guests. In the front rows, Sarah's fellow janitors sat beside Morrison Technologies board members, while nursing students mingled with Wall Street executives. Sarah stood before the mirror in what had once been her break room, now transformed into a bridal suite. Her wedding dress was elegantly simple, chosen by her, not the army of designers James's world had offered. Her mother's jade pendant hung at her throat, a testament to her heritage and the journey that had brought her here. "Ready?" asked Maria, her former supervisor from the cleaning staff, now one of her bridesmaids. "Your future husband is probably wearing a path in the chapel floor." Sarah smiled, remembering how James had insisted on this venue, despite his event planner's horror. "This is where our story began," he'd said. "This is where we were just two people connecting, without any pretense. This is where we should start our next chapter." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of changes, but not the kind the tabloids had predicted. Sarah had completed her nursing degree, graduating with honors, while simultaneously helping James establish the Morrison Medical Education Foundation. Their first round of scholarships had just been awarded to 50 students, each one with a story that reminded Sarah of her own journey. James had changed too. He'd restructured his company's employee benefits, ensuring living wages and education opportunities for all staff levels. The janitorial team now had direct input in building operations decisions, leading to more efficient and worker-friendly practices. The business papers called it revolutionary corporate culture change. James called it common sense. As Sarah walked down the aisle, she saw not just her future husband, but the life they'd built together. James stood there in his tuxedo, beaming with the same warmth he'd shown in his hospital bed when he was just a man with no memory, and she was just a woman who cared enough to help. Their vows were simple, personal. James promised to always see her, not just look at her. Sarah promised to keep him grounded while helping him soar. They exchanged rings, simple bands that meant more than all the diamonds in his vault. "You know," James whispered during their first dance, "that night in the alley, before I lost consciousness, I remember thinking how alone I'd felt in this world of wealth and power. Then I woke up to find you, someone who cared for me without knowing anything about me." Sarah leaned her head against his chest, hearing his steady heartbeat. "And I was just trying to get through each day, feeling like I was invisible to the world. Then I found someone who saw me completely." The reception lasted well into the evening, with custodial staff teaching board members to salsa dance while nursing students discussed healthcare policy with investment bankers. Two worlds had collided and created something entirely new, something real and lasting. As they left the hospital in their wedding car, they passed the alley where their story began. It no longer looked dark or threatening. Like them, it had been transformed by their story, now just another place where extraordinary things could happen to ordinary people who were brave enough to care. A soft groan broke the monotonous beeping of hospital monitors. Sarah, who had dozed off in the visitor's chair, jerked awake to find a pair of confused gray eyes staring at her. 3 days of waiting, of sneaking visits between shifts, and finally he was conscious. "Water," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah quickly poured a small cup from the bedside pitcher, helping him take careful sips through a straw. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to reach for the cup himself. "Easy there," she cautioned, gently pushing his hand back down. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. Let's take it slow." The man blinked at her, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. 3 days. His voice was clearer now, but held a note of bewilderment. I can't remember." His face contorted with effort, then panic flashed across his features. "I can't remember anything. Why can't I remember?" Sarah pressed the call button before turning back to him with what she hoped was a reassuring smile. The doctor said this might happen. You had a pretty serious head injury. I'm Sarah, by the way. I found you in an alley during the storm. He'd absorbed this information slowly, his hand drifting up to touch the bandage on his temple. Thank you, Sarah, he said finally, her name rolling off his tongue with a peculiar gentleness. I wish I could tell you my name in return, but he gestured helplessly. The doctor arrived then, conducting a series of tests while Sarah watched from the corner. The diagnosis was temporary retrograde amnesia, likely to clear up in days or weeks. The brain is remarkable at healing itself, the doctor explained. Just give it time. Over the next few days, Sarah continued her visits, bringing homemade soup in a thermos and sharing stories of her day. She told him about her nursing classes, her struggles with organic chemistry, and her dreams of working in pediatric care. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that made her feel heard in a way she rarely experienced. You cooked this yourself? He asked one evening, savoring the wonton soup she'd brought. It's amazing. My mother's recipe, Sarah replied, watching him eat with satisfaction. She always said food heals the soul as well as the body. Your mother sounds wise, he smiled, then looked down at his bowl pensively. I wonder if my mother... He trailed off, that lost look returning to his eyes. Sarah reached out impulsively, squeezing his hand. Hey, it'll come back. And until it does, you've got me in your corner. His fingers tightened around hers, warm and strong. I may not remember who I am, Sarah, but I know I'm fortunate to have found you. Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them. Something neither was ready to name, but both could feel. Neither noticed the news playing silently on the room's TV, where a ticker ran beneath a business report. Morrison Technologies stock continues to fall as CEO James Morrison remains missing for fourth day.